Houthi Red Sea threat, record VLCC new building orders, and Jones Act controversy. All these and much more in the latest episode of Maritime in Minutes. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, with our July news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined as usual by our correspondent Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. It may be summer in the Northern Hemisphere, and many people are on holiday, but the world of shipping has been far from dull. Gary, can you kick us off by taking us back to the first week in July?
Yeah, the ripples from the conflict in Iran are being felt all over the world, and not least of all in the United States, where the debate continues to rage over temporary Jones Act waivers. The waiver was initially put in place after the US and Israeli attacks on Iran, as leaders in the US feared that there could be a fuel shortage. The current waivers are set to expire in mid-August, but there are plenty of voices calling for an early end to the arrangement, as our man in the US, Barry Parker, reported. Those in the pro-Jones Act lobby argue that the waiver fails to deliver on its objectives, and it's simply shifting cargoes to foreign vessels. Allowing those foreign vessels to enter the US market will undercut domestic shipping companies and overall weaken US expertise and supply chains. Supporters of the waiver are calling for a permanent end to the Jones Act, as they always seem to. Since the waiver was launched in March, there have been around 195 Jones Act voyages carried out by foreign vessels, and gasoline and crude oil are the top two cargoes by a massive margin there. I think the fate of the waiver is entwined with the war in Iran, and observers are keen to note that the waiver seems at odds with Trump's America First approach, especially in the shipping industry, and his plans to revitalise US shipbuilding and other aspects of the industry over there.
Right, moving on to week one for myself, I'd like to have a look at container shipping and how the market seems to sort of, every time something bad's about to really happen, in terms of the actual how the shipping lines are doing, something happens in the market to bolster their earnings. One of the features of the container shipping market over the current decade is how successive crises have saved it from forecast disaster, as the supply chain disruption both constrains vessels capacity and acts as a demand driver. In the first part of the 2020s, the pandemic, far from causing an originally expected destruction of demand, resulted in a combination of supply chain disruption, port congestion, and e-commerce demand from billions trapped in lockdowns that drove container freight rates to seemingly unthinkable levels. Cash-rich shipping lines started buying up logistics companies and ordering more shiny new ships. By the latter part of 2023, all these new buildings were starting to put serious pressure on the market. But just as the bottom lines of companies started to turn red, along came the Red Sea crisis, and virtually all mainline shipping between Asia and Europe and the US East Coast diverted to the much longer route via the Cape of Good Hope, soaking up all that excess capacity, creating havoc at ports, and sent freight rates soaring again. Meanwhile, the money kept rolling in, and container lines kept on ordering new buildings. In something of a Groundhog Day moment going into this year, overcapacity started to put serious pressure on the market, and in Q1 some lines slid into the red. And along came the US and Iran war, disrupting supply chains again, and drove an apparent front-loading of shipments, and guess what? Freight rates shot back up again. How long the current boom can be sustained, this remains to be seen, with freight rates already starting to weaken in recent weeks, and looming in the background is a new building order book that now stands at a rather worrying 40% of the current fleet. Will this be the last time container shipping bottom lines are saved by the crisis this decade? Or could another black swan come along in coming years and take the sting out of that huge order book? If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
Now, my week two pick is kind of playing into that theme, really. Maersk announced that it had further plans to bring services back to the Red Sea, despite at the time there was an emerging piracy risk in the south. The Gemini Corporation, Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd announced they were sending some services back to Suez, one of their joint services, and then Maersk soon followed up with a couple of its own standalone services also going back to transiting Suez and the Red Sea. A precautionary suspension of Red Sea services since the conflict broke out in the Middle East gave way to some scattered transits in June, and Maersk were looking to build on that. Within a fortnight of the announcement, the Houthi in Yemen issued their threat to Saudi-linked shipping through Bab el-Mandeb, which would soon be followed by actual attacks on tankers, showing just how much can change in the space of a couple of weeks in shipping. The fast-moving situation over there in the Red Sea reminds me of the last time that lines actually announced that they'd be bringing ships back from that longer Cape of Good Hope route. In January, CMA CGM reversed course on plans to bring a service back to Suez within days, and Maersk shared similar plans which were muddied by the potential need for military escorts, and as you can tell by the latest announcements, never really amounted to much. Clarkson's data showed that Bab el-Mandeb transits were down by around 50% in, I think, the third week of July compared to the Q2 average after the Houthi made their threat. So it seems the risk perception has definitely evolved in the latter half of the month in the Red Sea.
Yeah, it's a very fluid situation, that one, and I think particularly the container lines, if they can avoid the sort of security threat, they are going to. Now, in my introduction, I mentioned that the sort of the summer holidays and people being on vacation, which I was actually for part of this month. So I'm going to choose a story from Gary for the second week, and that relates to the competition between international shipping centres, which has been increasingly fierce over the last couple of decades. Shipping's transnational nature makes it an industry where locations of operations and headquarters is not restricted by geography. However, despite this competitiveness, the Xinhua Baltic International Shipping Centre Development Index, that's a catchy title, that one, annual report has a tendency to be rather on the dull side. Oh look, Singapore is number 1 again, and London remains number 2, etc. Not so this year. That number 2 position has changed, with Shanghai overtaking London. Shanghai's importance has grown steadily, as it ranked 7th in 2014 when the index started. The Chinese megacity is of course home to the world's largest container port and a vibrant shipbuilding industry. Adding to these in the last year were a flagship logistics centre from Maersk, the launch of the North Bund International Legal Service Port, a new international ship inspection operations team from China Classification Society, and the arrival of representative offices from ICS and London P&I Club. While Shanghai has been on the rise, though, Singapore shows little sign of loosening its grip as the top shipping centre, a ranking it has held for all 13 years the index has been published.
Right, week 3 I'm going to move into, well, perhaps a man that we've heard too much of in the news recently, but it's not uncommon for Trump's post on his social media platform Truth to leave a sane person stunned or confused. But my week 3 pick is a particularly strong example, I think, of the madness that can come from the White House and how quickly things change. On the 13th of July, the president announced, completely out of the blue it seems, that the US would be known as the guardian for the Hormuz Strait, and, quote, as a matter of fairness, end quote, would be reimbursed for its security work in the area to the tune of 20% of the value of any cargo flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. This came as a bit of a shock, really, given that the US administration had been vocally opposed to any restrictions on freedom of navigation in the region, and even used Iran's attempts to limit traffic and impose fees on ships as justification for military intervention. That same Trump post also announced the relaunch of the US blockade of Iranian ports. And while the blockade is still standing at the time of recording, the US tariff of 20% on goods going through the strait fell to the old Tucker rule that Trump always chickens out. Less than 24 hours after announcing the idea, Trump U-turned and decided that charging for Hormuz Straits transits was no longer a good idea. Perhaps after someone pointed out, even just the optics or the practicalities of such an arrangement. The president said that he'd changed his mind after speaking with Middle East leaders, claiming that they had pledged a series of massive investments in the US in lieu of paying for US protection for seaborne cargoes. So a day after suggesting a fee, Trump told reporters, quote, "I don't think anybody should be able to charge a fee for the strait or for any other strait relationship in terms of other sections of the world. I don't think anybody should be really in that position, but we were doing it as a reimbursement. I'll leave the listeners to make their own judgment on that, I think.
Yeah, I did actually calculate what the fee would be for a VLCC, and it was something like $37.5 million at the prevailing oil price when he made that announcement for a single transit.
It's particularly interesting given that yesterday I wrote up a story about OFAC sanctions. The latest are being targeted at 2 companies in Iran that are responsible for mandatory insurance for going through the Strait of Hormuz on the Iranian side, which is effectively extortion in the US eyes, but is sort of what they were hoping to do, but just for more money.
There's a bit of irony in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
So, for week 3, I took a look at the growth in the VLCC order book, another story that Gary wrote about while I was on holiday. I mentioned earlier the burgeoning container ship new building order book, but it's not the only sector that's been going bananas when it comes to putting pen to paper on contracts for new ships. With the tanker market definitely enjoying days in the sun in terms of earnings, owners are clearly confident on the future, particularly when it comes to VLCCs. Maritime Strategies International described it as an astonishing year already for tanker contracting, with more VLCCs ordered in the first half of the year than any other full year in history. According to MSI figures, the 54.4 million deadweight of VLCCs ordered in the first 6 months of 2026 eclipsed the previous annual record of 32.6 million deadweight ordered in 2006 by some considerable margin. The huge run-up in new orders could place significant pressure on the market though down the line. MSI commented, around 83% of the vessels ordered in the first half of 2026 are slated for delivery in 2028 and 2029. VLCC contracting the first half has more than doubled scheduled deliveries for 2028, placing significant pressure on future market balances. We'll be looking at this in more detail in the Mid-Year Markets Outlook podcast with a team from MSI that will be coming out later this week.
Those outlooks are well worth a listen, and I'll take us into week 4 of July. Throughout the month, we were reporting attacks in the Middle East, unfortunately, and alongside those, a consistent campaign of strikes against commercial ships in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov by Russia and Ukraine. I picked out the story of Golden Leo. It was a general cargo ship that was hit by a Russian attack just off Odessa in Ukraine, causing the death of 9 crew and the Ukrainian pilot on board. The attack led to a fire on board, and ultimately, a couple of weeks later, the ship would go on to sink. This Golden Leo incident is an extreme example of the violence going on in the Black Sea, but there have been plenty more this month carried out by both Ukrainian and Russian forces. Ukraine began July with a really concentrated campaign of drone attacks on commercial ships in the Sea of Azov, which eventually spread to the Black Sea. The last counter I had was on the 22nd of July. Ukraine said it had launched 196 successful attacks against ships in the region in the sort of 3-week period of July. There were days on end where these daily updates brought more videos of UAVs heading towards vessels, and there was sort of grimly interesting aspect of the footage was which target area on the ship the drones were seeking. Some choosing to just head straight for the bridge, others for the deck and cargo areas, and others approaching from astern and detonating to the side of the exhaust stack. Obviously risk involved whichever target on board is chosen, but a beeline for the bridge is obviously incredibly dangerous for anyone on the bridge at the time. Russia has also attacked many ships while at berth, hitting vessels along with port infrastructure to try and limit Ukraine's logistics capabilities and military supply chains. Ukraine has particularly targeted tankers supplying Russian-occupied Crimea, and there's been some success in disrupting regional flows for both nations. Ship numbers in the area have fallen, and the Kerch Strait and various ports and oil terminals have been closed for periods this month due to the extreme risk in the region. Sadly, it's all just another example of seafarers ending up as casualties in a war that they have no stake in whatsoever. The Golden Leo's crew was made up of Syrian and Indian nationals, and 9 of them will not return home because they were operating a vessel moving corn from one place to another on the other side of the world.
That's an horrendous story, and I can't remember another period where shipping has been under attack on so many fronts and so many different locations. Right, I'm going to move on to a story that relates to the Strait of Hormuz and its effective closure, and how that has not just hit the movement of ships, but also the business of ports that they serve. DP World's flagship, Jebel Ali Port and Free Zone, sits inside that key waterway of Hormuz. It's a testament to just how important a hub it actually is. That Jebel Ali is the world's 10th largest container port, despite not sitting directly on the east-west trade lane, and ships effectively have to divert through Hormuz to get there. However, with the Strait of Hormuz remaining restricted, the terminal operator and shipping lines have had to look for other ways to serve this key hub in the Gulf. And that's been via intermodal connections across the UAE from Khor Fakkan in Sharjah and Fujairah. In a landmark deal, DP World signed an agreement in principle with Fujairah Ports Authority for a 50-year concession to develop 2 container terminals on UAE's east coast, including a 2.5 million TEU capacity container terminal. DP World said the new terminals in Fujairah would be connected to Jebel Ali and its free zone through its inland logistics network, and construction is expected to take in the region of 24 to 30 months. The deal to build terminals in Fujairah sees DP World making long-term contingencies for a situation where Hormuz transits are constrained.
Obvious benefits to that plan, but I think it will all still be happening well within reach of Iranian missiles, so it'd be interesting to see how that develops and whether new terminals themselves become a target. But I guess we'll see. I'll take us into the 5th week of July, and with the renewal of attacks in the Gulf and the Houthi taking the stage again in the Red Sea, it's no surprise that tanker rates are on the up again. And Paul Bartlett wrote in the last week of the month on how tanker rates are set to soar on the back of those challenges. Tanker owners probably not too worried about that order book overhang just yet. Around 2.5 million barrels of crude used to flow through Bab el-Mandeb, mostly to Asia from Saudi Arabia, before the Houthi blockade was announced, and that has since shrunk to near zero, although there are some vessels that appear to pass through every now and then unhindered. It would offer further support to rates if VLCCs are forced to avoid Bab el-Mandeb for the long term, as loading in Yanbu and then taking a diversion via Suez roughly doubles the distance to major Chinese and Asian ports, and adds the costs and delays of unloading some of the cargo from a VLCC and piping it across Egypt, so that the VLCCs can actually pass through, as they cannot when they're fully laden. Paul writes that the voyage from Yanbu to South Korea rises from 24 to 54 days when taking the Mediterranean route, and Potent says this adds a significant margin to the landed costs. Quote, the unusual geography of moving Yanbu crude to Asia without using the Bab el-Mandeb means that even a modest diversion can generate an outsized increase in ton miles, boosting tanker rates, said Potent. A factor that could perhaps limit some of the upside here is there was a spurt of attacks on crude oil infrastructure and production infrastructure across the region, which may offer some problems for actually finding volumes to be moving around.
Yes, and for my final pick of the month, I'm moving on to a story that extends the security risk for shipping into Egypt's Mediterranean coast. The Houthi blockade of the Red Sea is not the only expansion of threats we've seen to shipping in the last couple of weeks. Midweek was to bring strikes on LNG-related shipping assets on Egypt's Mediterranean coast. The Marshall Islands flagged floating storage and regasification unit Enagos Winter and the LNG carrier Gaslog Salem were hit by drones while moored at adjacent berths in the port of Damietta. The attack caused fire on both vessels, but fortunately all crew were uninjured in the incidents. Both vessels were later moved offshore. The Egyptian government has since confirmed that the incident was a drone attack, although no group has claimed responsibility. It does, though, represent a worrying widening of the conflict in the region and its impact on shipping. And with that concerning development in terms of maritime security, that is all we have time for on this episode of Maritime in Minutes. Links to all the stories discussed are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime News Podcast.